engineering having some stuff that we wanted to maybe pluck some good concepts from. And that is where, if you go to this, it's page 25, it's this licensure model with this big circle with the outer ring around it. That's how we landed on this potential model being, okay, we want to keep the core. We've heard loud and clear, we don't want the core CPA to change. We still have to know accounting, auditing, business reporting. Tax is super important. Even though I don't touch taxes, my clients don't pay taxes, I need to know enough about taxation to be a well-rounded CPA. And we want to introduce a new core of technology. And again, that doesn't mean we all have to go be computer scientists or know how to program. That's not what we're talking about. But understanding technology as it is tools in auditing, tools for business reporting, tools in tax, the SOC engagements, the internal controls that are inherent to technology systems. And so that's what we're talking about when we say tech. So we know we want this core, and that's important. But then we started thinking, however, we know that people are going to specialize. We know that people tend to start taking tax classes early on, and they know when they're sitting for the exam, they either have a job with a public accounting firm in tax, they have a job with a private company that's going to be in business reporting. Students know really where their area of passion is. So why don't we gear the exam towards that? Since we know we can't test all of this anymore, can we narrow it down so that everyone agrees on the core? What does that CPA have to know? What do they know today? And then can we layer in some of these advanced concepts, business reporting and auditing, tax compliance and planning, technology, innovation systems, and controls. And those would be kind of your advanced topics that perhaps that candidate for the exam could choose to take. Now, I don't know what that's going to look like yet. That's what we're doing now. That's the devil in the detail problem that we're trying to work through now. How does that actually work in real life in an exam situation? How does that work in real life in education? And those are the details that are being worked out. But again, the licensure model, strong core, accounting, auditing, tax, technology, deeper knowledge in one of these three primary disciplines. And when we put this together, we don't want it to be stale. So in 10 years, when there's some new discipline that we don't even know what it is today because technology is moving so fast and the way we do things is changing so quickly, we want to be able to say, yes, you can just tack on that next advanced thing that a CPA is doing. So it needs to be adaptive, it needs to be flexible. The beauty about this model, it's still just CPA is a CPA. Nobody's going to know what you took on the exam, just like they don't know what I don't even remember what my score was, to be honest. I know I didn't get a,
Sure you won the Elijah
I didn't,
once.
no, I did not win an award, put it that way. So nobody knows when you become a CPA what your score was. Nobody's going to know what extra questions did you take. It's not some declaration of a discipline or a major. It's really just what questions did you select for your simulation question. And so it's not going to be labeled at all. You're still a CPA is a CPA is a CPA. You can go with that CPA license and do whatever you want to with it, just like you do today. We feel like this model also enhances public protection because it does give that candidate a head start really in what their discipline is. And they don't have to do it. If you decide, okay, later on I don't want to do tax, I want to do something else, nothing's going to prevent that person from changing just like they do today or evolving into doing something different. But I think they're going to hit the ground running a little bit faster knowing that deeper knowledge because of their education and because of the exam testing that they did. And again, I just, not to beat a dead horse, but the next two slides where it shows the boxes, this is to drive, if this was on a screen, what I had was the boxes in these dark blue were all flowing into the dark blue circle. So all of those boxes that you see, business law, economics, finance, audit, some degree of advanced accounting and advanced tax, that would still be in the core, just like it is today. And you might start wondering, well, wait a minute, is the exam going to be longer? How do you still keep it like it is today, but then add some more things around it? we're talking now, and I can give you a little indication because I sat in on the exam committee a couple weeks ago. They're talking about still keeping the concepts in that exam, but perhaps if you're familiar with the exam blueprint, you'll understand this language. Instead of doing a detailed simulation on derivatives, you might have to answer a question that tests whether you know and understand the concept. But you're not going to have the follow-up question to do this giant 15-minute simulation on how to account for derivatives. Because you answered the question on what it is, you have the knowledge, you recognize it when you see it, and we're trying to say, okay, that's enough for derivatives. Maybe that's enough for governmental accounting, fund accounting. We're not going to ask you to do a giant simulation on putting together a comprehensive annual financial report for a city. But you'll be able to read and understand, learn and understand, know enough that you're recognizing, you know the accounting concepts, that you know it's GASB-driven accounting standards. So we're talking about taking some of these very advanced accounting topics that are on the exam today. They'll stay on there, but they'll be less intensive unless you've chosen that business reporting and accounting simulation. You might get it there, but somebody that chooses a tax simulation question, they probably aren't going to get the advanced derivative question. So it really gives that candidate a little bit more choice on what that advanced simulation is, but everybody still has to understand the core and answer the questions in the multiple choice with respect to the understanding of it. So that's just an example. We don't know exactly what it's going to look like, but that's the direction that it seems to be heading. And then if you go to the next page, these colored boxes, again, if this was on the slides, these colored boxes would go into whatever core they belong to. Again, so, you know, the very advanced accounting topics, advanced tax, advanced info systems, and then analytics. And those would flow into that extra area. I mean, we don't know, again, I'm just going to say, I'll say it again, I don't know what that's going to look like. Will it mean that there's 5 parts of the exam instead of 4? Maybe. Maybe we'll go to 3 parts. Maybe there's still 4 parts and then there's an advanced simulation on each section. We don't know. That's just now being discussed. So if you're a strategist and you have great ideas on that, you know, send them in. Send them in to me and Dan, and we'll, you know, that's the part that we're in today. We have, I like to fondly call them my strike forces, where we have a few people that are have expertise both in the exam and in the education side. We've joined forces with the AICPA, and this is like a 6-week project for people to kind of start to draw on a whiteboard what that's going to look like. And for the exam, you know, we have to get psychometricians involved. This has to still be a very rigorous, robust exam that meets all the psychometrician standards. So we haven't even gotten to that stage yet, but just starting to pencil it out. What's it going to look like? The hope is that by the regionals in June, we're going to have something to give to you to say, this is what we're thinking. This is what the detail is around this broad concept, and get your input at that. We'll also be having a series of webcasts at the end of March, where we'll also be unveiling some more detail around this model. And so you'll be invited to those. We're going to set them up so that 2 regions will be invited to each webcast, but if you can't make your assigned webcast, we'll give you the phone numbers for the other ones. So really you'll have a choice of 4 different ones at the end of March. I know the timing's terrible. You know, the volunteers working on all this stuff, they're all CPAs too, and the timing's terrible for everybody, but we can't afford to wait, you know, because a lot of this will have to go through legislation changes by state boards. So we're hoping to tee this up so that this can get into legislation in 2021. And so that's very aggressive. And I don't know if we'll make it, but that's what we're aiming for, to get buy-in from all the state boards this summer. We'll have exposure drafts that are being released this summer, and then go into rulemaking and potentially any statute changes for the boards that may need statute changes, so that we can get this going and have a new exam within a couple of years. So it's aggressive. I know a couple of you have seen this in more detail. Some of you, this might be the first time. Are there questions, comments, suggestions?
Yeah, so 2 things. One is, since the critical thing is to get this done
short window, I think it's very important for me as a board member to understand what is the board's stake in it as opposed to the AICPA's stake in it. And I'll be very candid. There's a question of regulatory capture. If I am seen as sitting on a board that is acting to somehow resolve problems that the CPA profession should resolve on its own, then that does not serve the public interest. So I think any effort by the boards to get involved and to opine on this would always have to look at the public interest,
Yes,
I think, right?
yes.
So from that perspective, I'd suggest going back and thinking about some of the things that are in the message as you have laid it out for us, and it's evolved considerably, I think, since I last heard it. I didn't make it to the annual meeting, unfortunately. But there's still this issue of uncomfortable tension. Why does one CPA exam have to cover it all? And that's, I think, at the nub of it, is that if you are going to say that one CPA exam that is going to license a tax practitioner in Bothell as opposed to somebody who's going to be sitting in New York and auditing Citibank, one exam is supposed to cover all of that. That seems to be very broad. So I'd like to sort of, for me to kind of understand this, I think we need to have a vision of what is it that the CPA exam is a minimum certification for. The profession can go on and have tag on additional. You can't audit Citibank unless you show me that you've read FAS 157 and FAS 143 and you know it's stone cold and you can teach a university class in it, right? Because ideally I'd like the lead partner of the Citibank audit in my advanced financial accounting class to tell my students how to interpret these standards, right? So we're trying to do too much. Are we trying to ride too many horses would be, I think, the critical thing to a timely adoption. Because I heard a lot of things in here, and I think it'd be really good to unpack those components that the AICPA is doing to keep up the demand for the AICPA certification, to kind of keep the CPA profession relevant, etc., which are all great. I would like to have a profession to regulate, but I think splitting that off from what the regulatory stake in this debate is, and focusing the board's attention on our regulatory portion would be very, very helpful. Because the message right now is that you're going to make the exam less specific in order to get what? Because you're dialing back the specific thing, moving it more back towards what a general university education is supposed to do, which is concepts and principles, right? So I heard a number of tensions in there, and I think it'd be really good to work those out as you move this thing forward.
If I could.
And it's really competency, is that what you were gonna?
Yeah, well, I was gonna say from a regulatory standpoint, and a board standpoint, certainly, you know, one of the things, a lot of work is being done. Lori mentioned the advisory groups. There was an education advisory group that met twice, really talking about, you know, what is in the Uniform Accountancy Act model rules, what boards actually adopted, because that is a regulatory piece. What are you using as a standard for licensure? And if you were to go to the model rules, it talks about accreditation. It talks about levels. And it says, for example, if you go to an AACSB accredited or a similarly accredited accounting program, then there's very limited review of transcripts. But if you go to level 2, which is a business school accreditation by ASB or equivalent accrediting body, then you wouldn't review accounting or business, but you'd review that other. And if you go to level 3, which is they don't have that, they just have general accreditation, then you perhaps would review an entire transcript. And through our meetings, we learned that accreditation has nothing to do with verifying that a candidate has taken the necessary requisite coursework that's required in Washington or anywhere else. So does leveling really make sense? And there's only 7 jurisdictions that have adopted that kind of leveling, and one of them actually adopted a version from about 8 years ago. They're not even up to speed with where it is. So rather than, you know, trying to make radical changes, how can we shrink the change and make the UAA more conforming to where boards of accountancy are right now? What are the majority of the boards looking at? And so I think that's the piece that goes to what boards are doing and what's going to be of interest to boards. The same thing with the examination. I don't, and we don't know yet, but I don't envision the same kinds of changes with respect to examination that perhaps there would be with education. But there are boards that perhaps list the specific four areas, or the four sections of the exam right now in statute. Well, that certainly limits a board in the exam going forward, because as soon as an exam section name changes, they got to get a statutory change. So there's a lot of dialogue, discussion focused on boards, what boards are doing, what they've adopted in rule or in statute. So a lot of that discussion is going on. And so it's that equal component, recognizing, I think from the AICPA side, it's recognizing what the profession is doing and evolving into, but then also recognizing from a licensing standpoint and measuring minimum competency for licensure, you know, the rules as written, the model rules as written, may have to be amended in the UAA to be more respectful of what boards have done over time. So it's a two-pronged really approach. And I appreciate what you're saying about boards and their responsibilities. And that certainly has been lost. All of these advisory groups that Lori's appointed, they've included educators that have been on boards. They include practitioners that have a background with education that are on boards, and executive directors. So, I mean, there's been a lot of input from the boards of the country.
I think it's important to recognize that this is an exam for minimum competencies. It's not to test the partner-owned engagement for City Day. It is the entry into the profession. And it's about relevancy, and I think you made the comment it's going to be less specific. I don't think it's going to be less specific. I think it's going to be more relevant. And there'll be areas of specificity that are defined by the different disciplines that for the first time the candidate may have some choice in where their levels of specificity are tested. But it is going to make it more relevant, and again, entry level into the profession, not somebody 10 years into their career or 20 years into their career. So
it's kind of interesting because we're having a lot of discussion about exam content too, and Laura mentioned derivatives earlier, and it's interesting because you know one of the things we've talked about is how much does a individual newly licensed CPA need to know about derivatives? You know, is it something that's just a general knowledge that exists, or does it have to be tested at all? Is that something you learn in practice because you have a specialty? And derivatives and taking derivatives off the exam or leaving it on has been a discussion point for me around the country, and it's funny, because a lot of times I see you shaking their heads going, yeah, why do we have derivatives on the exam? I was in Oklahoma this summer, and they go, and one of the members there said, we use derivatives every day in my firm. And in contrast, there are also questions on farm tax credits. And I sat in some focus groups in Chicago and in LA, and they're going, why are you asking me about farm tax credits? We don't deal with that in LA or Chicago. And so there are pieces, you know, information on the exam right now that you say, is that really basic knowledge that every CPA needs to know? Or is that some specific knowledge that you're going to learn through practice in your specific region of the country? And so it's really weighing all that. A lot of that will come out through the practice analysis that's going on now. There's actually an exposure draft out now for the current exam, but certainly in the future as we have CPA evolution moving forward.
Yeah.
So, you know, the goal, I would think, is to have candidates successfully pass this exam and be qualified to enter into a field where they want to succeed. So right now we have a list of courses that have to be completed prior to taking the exam. Some of these specialties are going to require an evaluation of what that actually looks like, what those courses actually look like. Do you see that course complexity changing? Because I know some institutions have addressed this, but most institutions have not. And so you're looking at a retooling at an academic level that does not happen overnight. This takes several years, and it takes a juggling of what courses are available and what are not. So just at that end, the ramifications of all the other things in changing the content of this exam, I mean, are we gonna go back to a Becker type of where everybody's gotta go for a prep course to understand what the exam's gonna be, or are you looking for, the academic preparation to give us a better, well-rounded candidate who can pass this test?
Well, I learned in my years on this board, don't mess with the academics. We do not mess with the, that came through loud and clear every time we tried to do anything with education. And, interestingly, we've looked at what the UAA says today, and I could make a case that says the UAA as it is written today fits this paradigm, fits this model. And here's the big if only all of the states had adopted the UAA, we probably wouldn't have to change anything in education. It's already in there. Because the UAA is quite general with that whole thought that, and I was on the UAA committee and shared it when we drafted these rules, the whole thought was we don't want to dictate to the universities what they should be putting in their curriculum. We need to keep this general enough so it gets what we want as regulators. We want that candidate to have the basic level that hits these content, and we want them to be able to pass that exam. But the UAA is not that specific. And so I don't think we're changing our approach on that. Tell me if I'm wrong, Tom, but I don't think we're changing our approach. The problem is very few, if any, states adopted the UAA education as it was drafted. And so that's why we're stuck with this just complete variety of some states dictating the courses. Other states are very general. But our goal here is to keep it, again, as general enough that universities can still do whatever they want, but give them some guidance. Hey, this is really what it takes to get a licensed CPA out of your education system and into the, being able to sit for the exam. But yeah, nowhere have I heard that anybody wants to go to that level of specificity and talk about courses.
Well, you still have to prepare, and if you haven't taken any analytic courses, you're behind the 8 ball, or if you haven't taken other analysis or communications,
That's what. That's no different than
right,
it is
exactly,
today.
I know, but still.
When you look at our statutes and our rules, 1804, 105 just says they got to meet the educational
Right.
standards set forth in the rule. When you look at 43060, it's pretty general, and I could read this a couple different ways, and depending upon the educators and how they drive the class and the description of the class, we may have nothing to do, or we may have work to do. So that's where it gets fun. And if a student doesn't take that course that they need, that is their problem. If they've met the requirements to sit for the exam but don't have the requisite knowledge because of course selection, that's outside of our purview. So I think where the fun becomes is when we start looking at, do we need to tweak 060 at all?
And personally, I think the universities are way out ahead of us in this. I'm on the advisory board for the Master's of Accountancy program at the University of Washington. There are so many technology courses that are being just built into that program, and they already have computer scientist majors actually coming through that MPAC program. I mean, and I realize that the University of Washington is ahead of some of the other schools across the nation, and it's not widespread, but we've got stories like this in every state of the universities are there already. We as the regulators are running behind to try to catch up to what the schools are already doing because the market is driving it. The CPA firms are driving it. The private companies hiring CPAs right out of school, they're driving it. And so the market has already created this situation where technology is a huge part of the curriculum. And we have nothing, it's not on the exam, it's not in our rules. And the fear, to be quite honest, within this room is if we don't get our act together, there's going to be some other group of consultants that take over the attest function in this area, and it won't be CPAs. And then we'll become obsolete. And, this is, right, we're protecting the public. We have safeguards in place to protect the public. some other group coming through wouldn't. So I just feel like it's our duty as regulators to continue that, and this is one way to safeguard that attest function and make sure that we have the protection of the public and that CPAs are armed properly to be able to do this work.
You had something.
Yeah, as a professor, and we just revised our requirements for our master's degree. One of the organizations to perhaps partner with is the AACSB, which is the top level accrediting association for colleges of business. And so they now require essentially data analytics or something like that in order to have your accounting program. And so that's actually been the push-pull, and that's bring about. So these other organizations absolutely, and AACSB is a real good one to look for. And so that's kind of pushing and pulling the academic institution, and several institutions are adjusting their master's program as we are.
I was going to add that we actually have had those discussions. We've had calls, meetings with AACSB as well as AAA,
Yeah.
sharing our ideas, our thoughts, and soliciting their input on this. And generally, they think this is a great idea because they see the way that the profession is evolving. Next Saturday, a couple folks are going to be meeting. I don't know the acronym for the group, but I think there's a conference in California of business school deans that it's going to be meeting. We're going to have some folks there going and talking about this. AACP has actually put together a group of academics as well and solicited their input. So there's a lot of outreach going on to the academic community overall, both the accrediting bodies and the organizations to solicit input. And I think that's very important because you don't want to see change without including that voice. The other thing, certainly I would suggest is that programs, academics should look at the CPA exam blueprint. Because that's really telling you what the subject matter is and how it's being tested on the exam, whether it's very high level multiple choice or it's a very technical level knowledge, especially knowledge and skills through simulation. So I think that provides that roadmap, certainly a lot better than the old content specification outline that used to exist. So a lot of work going on with the academic community right now.
So what's the plan to move forward with the heterogeneity among the boards? From what I understood, there are many stakeholders on the academic side and on the intellectual content side who will give us the input, and whether it's the ACSB is involved, other organizations are involved. So from the boards, what I understood both of you to be getting at is that there's heterogeneity among the boards in terms of what they will accept. So should the CPA exam just be there and a particular board finds that somehow the new CPA exam as it is, it's acceptable to Washington and those states that have just sort of, broader definition of what you need to be, versus the states that have narrow definitions, that you have to have this, you have to have this. What are those state boards likely to do? Or are there components that the AICPA can add saying that if you want to go and get your license in Georgia, you have to do this, or if you have to do that, and therefore the general certification of a CPA remains what it is, and in addition, you take extra papers if you want to be registered in particular states or get your license in particular states.
We're not looking at that model. It's a CPA, it's a CPA nationwide. It's very similar to the model that's being used now because there are states that are focused on course content that say this is the content you need in order to take the exam. And then there are some states that are very specific and say, in order to become a CPA in our state, you're going to take these 10 accounting business courses or 15 courses, whatever that is. And so that diversity exists today, and yet everybody becomes a CPA.
But they don't become a CPA, they're licensed to practice as a CPA. You have to have the institute, you have to pass the institute's exam to be a CPA, right?
Right.
But the board cannot define what constitutes passing the CPA examination, except to say that we will not license you as a CPA unless you have this additional knowledge. Is that correct?
There is mention of content in some state rules right now that it should include things like accounting, auditing, attestation, tax.
Yeah.
So there are general guidelines, but there's not that specificity. It's really based on, here's, right now in the UA, it's like, here's a list of accounting type topics, so take some or all of the following, knowing that this is the stuff that a minimally competent CPA should know in order to be a CPA.
But even the states with the specific requirements, there's mobility. So they're not going to not allow someone to come into their state if it came from a state such as Washington with more general requirements. So that exists today and it does not seem to be affecting mobility.
And mobility is basically practicing across state lines with a license. So you're got a Washington license, you're practicing in Oregon. You know, a good example is if I went to school here, I got licensed in Washington, and I want to move to Austin, Texas. If I want to, now get a Texas license, there might be additional hurdles. I think Texas, for example, requires a specific ethics course at in your academic program. So they may say, well, you meet all the requirements except this one course, so if you want a Texas license, you gotta go back and take that course. But generally, there are no barriers to practice through mobility, being a licensee of Washington, practicing on a temporary basis in any other jurisdiction.
Then I don't frankly see the constraints, so I'll shut up and I'll follow up with you guys offline and with Tom, because I then don't know what the problem is, why the urgency. Just do what you need to do on the exam and then rely on mobility to allow people to move around. And if somebody needs to go and practice in Texas or New York or Georgia or Calcutta, for example, just learn Bengal sales tax laws. Take a course from Calcutta University on Bengal sales tax laws and get on with your life. Why do we need to agonize over all of this, is what I'm not understanding.
Does, because there are states that will have to change their laws or regulations.
But suppose they can't because of the current regulatory environment, then the practitioner, the law cannot be expected, the law of the state of Washington cannot be expected to change for the convenience of a practitioner, right? So they'll just have to go and get that additional certification. The boards may have to do nothing. The boards will just say simply, Rajib, go learn Bengal sales tax law if you want to
We're
practice
just trying to be
in Calcutta.
Responsive to every single state, and there are states that will need NASBA's help in getting their statutes updated. That's all we're saying.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, sorry.
Here in Washington, we're general enough, we're probably fine, but
That's probably why I'm
other
asking the
states need
question.
more assistance.
Okay,
Thank you, thank you.
We good with seat evolution for the time being? I'll just quickly wrap it up.
If you want more CPA evolution, go to NASBA meetings, because there's obviously
Well, yes,
evolution.
we're going to,
Listen to my webcast.
certainly the Executive Directors Conference is coming up mid-March. The AICPA's regional council meetings are coming up the following week in March, mid-March, the third week, fourth week of March, whatever it is. And then, as Lori mentioned earlier, we're planning on having webcasts a week after the Executive Directors Conference, 4 days. I think we're carving out 2 hours each day. And going to say, okay, the Pacific region, where Washington is, and another region, you'll be on Tuesday. And we're going to invite everybody to participate on Tuesday in the Pacific region. But if you're not available Tuesday, you're more than welcome to then sign up for Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday, or whatever the day is. Because we want everybody to be engaged and not have to wait until the regional meetings in June, when we hope to have an exposure draft and share this. We want you to be engaged throughout the process. If you read the NASBA State Board report, we've been putting articles in that each month, kind of giving an update. We talked in January about the Education Advisory Group and who was on that and their charge. This month, I just wrote an article in the past few days that will go into February, talking about what we've done during January. And oh, by the way, Lori had a hand in establishing an examination advisory group. Here's what their charge was, who was on that. So again, I don't think anybody can argue against having too much information, but we want to share and at least tell you the steps we're taking as we continue to move forward down this path, and ultimately share more with you at the regional meetings. Page 22 of it is just a code of professional conduct map, and in the upper left-hand side is just, here's the differences amongst the boards. 9 boards adopt the AICPA code of professional conduct by reference. 28 have exceptions. Some have state code of conducts that reference the AICPA code, and some just have their own code. You can see the breakout there. I will tell you, Washington has been viewed as having it with referencing the code of exceptions. I went back and looked when this analysis was done, and had things with client records and record retention, commissions, referral fees, contingency fees, firm organizations and names. And those tend to be the two big ones, client records and firm naming conventions. It's pretty interesting. There are some states that are very conservative in allowing firm names. It's either got to be the name of a partner, the initials of a current or former partner of a firm, or owner of the firm, that's it. There are others that will take anything, AAA, Accounting Services, LLP. And you might have 4 A's or 5 A's, because when there was a phone book, you wanted to be at the top of the list in the yellow pages. Integrity and objectivity and solicitation and advertising were the ones that we saw when we did this analysis about a year ago. Finally, CP reciprocity. You can see those with full reciprocity in blue, those aren't, are in red. And I go back to Ms. Morgan's point earlier. She said she was licensed in Washington and Virginia. And so, for me, the easy example is CP ethics. Your primary principal place of business is Washington, I assume. You're here, you're on this board. So it's reasonable then to say you're taking the Washington ethics course every registration period. So wouldn't it be good if the Virginia board, knowing that while you're licensed there and you have a responsibility to know the rules in Virginia, should you necessarily also have to take the Virginia ethics course on top of the Washington ethics course when you're not there a majority of your time? And that's really what CP reciprocity is a jurisdiction recognizing another. I can remember back in the early 2000s being at a NASDAQ meeting, and a large firm partner stood up and said, you know, I'm licensed, this is pre-mobility obviously, but I'm licensed in 31 jurisdictions. And I have to take an ethics course in 28 of them. When do I take the other CPE I have to take in order to become compliant? So you can see the reason that CP reciprocity is out there. There is a carve out for those states that don't have a CP requirement. That is Wisconsin. In the original version of this map, it was black. I did not want a black sweep. So I changed it to yellow, and then I made the mistake of going to Minnesota earlier this year, and they asked me if I did it because of the cheese heads. No, I didn't change it yellow because of the cheese heads. I just felt it was a better color than black going forward. But
I thought they were getting there.
They are.
They're getting it, aren't they?
So they
And we're blue now.
Yeah.
We're blue.
Okay. So they passed a law in 17, and it'll be effective in 2021. So eventually, everybody will have it. Certainly, it's important to know that doesn't mean that people, CPAs in Wisconsin, are not taking CPE. If you're in a firm that's a member of the AICPA, you're an AICPA member, you have a requirement to take CPE. And there are yellow book requirements and all sorts of other requirements that are out there that the vast majority of CPAs will probably say taking CPE at this point. So with that, I will just say it's certainly always fun to come out and visit boards. I enjoy it a great deal. I appreciate the fact how interactive you've been with us this morning to talk about this. I know we might have went a little longer than you expected, but we appreciate your feedback. It's something that certainly informs us and lets us be then more informed when we have meetings within NASPA or meetings with the AICPA. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both. Yeah, we really appreciate it. And for those of us that have been in the NASPA meeting, NASPA has taken a lot of feedback. And it's been a very deliberative process.
Thank you.
Over quite a few years.
I hope you all come to the June regular meeting.
Absolutely. So let's take a break. Let's take a 15-minute break. So.